Great, okay, I think we'll begin. So firstly, my name is Georgia. I'm the Advocacy Officer at Airwars, and we're really excited that you are joining us today for a report launch and our discussion, which is exploring urban warfare. So this is a Zoom webinar which was being recorded, and the Q&A will be open throughout, so please do write questions generally or even just aimed at a particular panelist. And these will be picked up in the Q&A at the end. I think we're hoping to have about 10 minutes of questions. So we're really excited to be joined by a fantastic group of panelists and MP first respondents. So thank you so much for joining. And I'm going to hand over now to Laura Boileau, who is the coordinator of the International Network on Explosive Weapons, who will be the chair and the moderator for this event for her introduction. So yeah, thank you again to all of the panelists and MPs and attendees for joining today. And over to you, Laura.
Thank you, Georgia, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, and thanks so much for tuning in and joining us for the next hour. And thanks, of course, to Airwars for both organising this event and for producing this report called Why Did They Bomb Us?, which looks at civilian harm from the use of explosive weapons in a few different urban contexts, including the Gaza Strip, Israel, and Syria. And I mean, I read this report over the last couple of days, and it's not an easy read by any means, but it's certainly an important one and the product of many months' research and analysis as part of Airwars' ongoing work tracking and documenting military actions and civilian harm. And their work is absolutely crucial, both in terms of enabling all of us to access the data that they put out in their analysis, and for our understandings of military operations in specific contexts and our understanding of civilian harms in these situations. So these findings are extremely important to inform us all and to help us to, and others to inform next steps in how to take action to address this and to prevent it. To get us started today, and before we turn to the report findings and other presentations, I'm going to share some remarks on behalf of INU in relation to the ongoing political work on this issue. So in my role at Article 36, I coordinate the International Network on Explosive Weapons, INU. And INU is a global coalition of civil society organisations. We formed in 2011 to address the human suffering from the use of explosive weapons in towns and cities and other populated areas. Our network has members in around 40 different countries. So it includes Airwars as well as Humanity Inclusion and PACS, who we'll hear from shortly. And it includes humanitarian organisations that work directly with affected communities that provide urgent medical care and other humanitarian assistance. Some organisations help with the immediate aftermath of conflict, for example, clearing up explosive remnants of war. And some work very closely with militaries, helping to inform them both in terms of their policy and practice and how to better protect civilians. And many members do research like we're about to hear today and outreach and advocacy with parliamentarians and the media. We're going to hear shortly from Emily about the situations in Palestine and Israel and Syria. But sadly, these case studies are representative of a broader pattern of harm. Each year we see tens of thousands of civilians killed and injured, and we've documented this over the last decade, where we've seen each year civilian harm incidents in around 50 to 60 countries as a result of explosive weapon use in cities, towns, and other populated areas. And we're talking here about weapon systems such as aircraft bombs, artillery, heavy mortars, rocket systems, missiles, all weapon systems that impact a wide area, and weapon systems that were not designed for use in town centres and other populated areas. These are weapon systems that were intended for use in open battlefields. And when we see them used in town centres and other populated areas, we see a devastating impact on civilian populations. Beyond the very high levels of civilian casualties and injuries, we also see psychological harm from people living under bombing, and extensive harm from the destruction caused to civilian infrastructure that's often located in town centres, such as housing, hospitals, schools, but also from destruction of essential services like power supplies, water and sanitation, which has huge knock-on effects and that lasts for a very long time, often, beyond conflicts ending themselves. But turning now for a few words on the political work, and I think on a more hopeful note, we are very pleased that discussions are about to be underway again to develop an international political declaration that will place restrictions on the use of explosive weapons in towns and cities and other populated areas, as well as other important measures. And this has come as a key and repeated recommendation from the UN Secretary General, and it's urgently needed. And we hope to see this come to fruition early next year. It's one of the things that have been delayed by the onset of COVID, but consultations are now scheduled for Geneva in February. And I think there are a few key components that are essential to make sure that this is going to be a successful endeavour. First of all, an international political declaration needs to set new international standards and expectations for behaviour. And in doing so, it needs to stigmatise harmful practice. And whilst it's not going to be a new treaty or new law, our expectation is a declaration can communicate the problem that we're concerned about, and it can commit states to take action beyond what's already required by the law, including through policy changes and operational changes that can be implemented at a national level. Secondly, and the centrepiece of what we see in a political declaration, must be a commitment on states not to use explosive weapons when they have wide area effects in populated areas. So here we're talking about explosive weapons systems that have a large blast and fragmentation radius, weapon systems that fire multiple munitions across an area, or systems that are inherently inaccurate. And this requires militaries to understand both the area effects of weapon systems, but also their context of use, and in particular, the urban environment. And thirdly, and because this declaration has been driven very much by humanitarian concerns, it must also provide an effective response to harm where it's already happened, as well as putting in place preventative measures. So it needs to help victims of explosive weapon use through assistance, but also by committing states to collect and share data on any ongoing use of explosive weapons, on civilian casualties and civilian harm, and that results from explosive weapon use. And so beyond NGO monitoring, it's going to be important that under this declaration, states are also doing this and sharing this data. And I'm optimistic about this political declaration. There is a good draft declaration text, and we expect a new draft to come out in the next few days or couple of weeks. And despite some reluctance by states, there's also a lot of willingness and commitment to get a good outcome by many states and civil society organisations. So I'm confident that we can get a good outcome that will have a humanitarian benefit. And we are very lucky today to be joined by two members of Parliament that will share some thoughts on the sort of action that they're involved in and that they think are needed to address this. But before that, I'm going to introduce you to Emily Tripp, who is the research manager at Airwars, and she's the author of this report. So Emily, over to you.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thanks for that introduction and that kind of very comprehensive overview of exactly the context in which we hope this report will be understood and read. And thanks also for all the participants who are joining today. I think I'm just going to begin by explaining a little bit about Airwars and what we do and how we got to the findings. And then I'll touch upon those findings and then kind of really defer over to my colleagues to kind of speak about how we can deal with those findings and how those findings can be used and fit into these kind of broader political processes. So if we go to the first slide, Georgia, I mean, the basis of everything that Airwars does is to build an archive, and that archive is based on local reports of civilian harm in conflict. So what we've done as part of this project, looking into this report, is the same approach that we've taken for the monitoring we've done across many different conflicts. We've been looking at Syria for the past several years. We've looked at Libya, and that approach is the kind of the same one that we've used. So initially we built this microsite, so it's a kind of subsection of our website where we've collated all of the different civilian harm allegations, and that's what you can see on the screen here is just a kind of screen grab. We've mapped them, we've kind of put them together and created certain graphics, so you can go and have a look at those. So that's really kind of analyzing the aggregates of the civilian harm data. Then we also produced this report, which, as Laura said, we've taken a quote directly from one of the civilians who was affected by the conflict, and we've looked at how we can understand the civilian harm allegations that we've seen, and I'm going to talk about some of the findings of this report. And then finally, we created this interactive neighborhood map, which is a way to kind of visualize those allegations of civilian harm and then really navigate our database. It's something we're kind of building on in Airwars, is saying, okay, we have this huge archive now, how can you engage with it and understand what that means? So everything, if you go to just Airwars.org, you can find all the different ways that we've tried to kind of package up that information so that it's very clear for you to understand. You can go to the next slide, Georgia. So, as I said, we built this archive in the same way that we've done all of our archives. Initially we have primary language researchers in all different languages. So here we were looking at Hebrew language sources, we were looking at Arabic, we were looking at English. We found, as you can see, almost 4,000 unique sources of civilian harm allegations in the Gaza Strip over the course of those 10 days. So that could be something that ranges from, somebody who tweets and says, this is my house, it's been destroyed, all the way to somebody posting a video on Facebook. It could be a local journalist who's created an article. And so all of these kind of unique sources, we then document them and digitally preserve them. And I think that's a kind of underlying important point when we think about all of these discussions, especially going into the kind of advocacy conversation we have and the kind of conversations around what do we do with this information. I think it's important to remember that we have this enormous evidence base, and that's what we're kind of building everything on. We have a team of geniuses who do this geolocation work, where they go and look at different pictures, they look at videos, they look at shadows, they look at lots of clever things, satellite imagery, and they basically look at all of those different unique sources and then say, okay, we think within this kind of margin of error, this number of meters, we think that civilian harm allegation happened in that area. So that's really enabled us to build that, the neighborhood map. It's enabled us to do a lot of the work that I'll show you a bit later on in terms of identifying kind of where strikes are taking place or where civilian harm has been alleged in proportion to, for example, population centers. So I think, there are some statistics on here, but I would really encourage you all to kind of go and interrogate the archive for yourself. An important note, in Airwars, we always consider our archive live. So if there are new pieces of information that come to light, we will change those in the assessment, and that will change the kind of the graphics, and it'll change the information we have. And we really encourage kind of anybody who has information to come forward and help us figure out those, what was taking place in these assessments. And then an important kind of final piece of the puzzle for us is basically grading and assessing each of those civilian harm cases, where we look at, I think the important thing for us is not to say that we verify claims, because that's not our role. We archive them and we categorize them. So we say, for example, in this civilian harm incident, all the sources alleged that it was taking place as a result of Israeli action, or there was a kind of contested attribution of harm in that case. So it could have caused from Palestinian misfire, for example, or Israeli action. And that's all documented within all of those sources. If you pop to the next slide, Georgia. That's just an example of the geolocation work. So these are the overall findings, and this is, I know that it's quite difficult to kind of digest lots of different numbers in a presentation, so I'm going to try and not over-datarize this talk, but I think this is the kind of key point for us, and this was the starting point of our analysis. And we were saying, we've been monitoring civilian harm in Syria, as I said, for several years. We've been looking at all different belligerents in Syria. So we've been looking at the US coalition, we've been looking at Russian forces, for example, and we've been monitoring and documenting Israeli action. And we can see, as we found over the past several years that we've been monitoring this, that the number of civilians that are reported by the local community to have been killed by Israeli action is between 14 and 40. So everything you'll see, all of our data is presented in ranges because, as I said, we're not verifying information, we're just reporting what the local community is saying. The lowest possible estimation that the community is saying is 14, for example. The highest possible estimation is 40. So you can see that very small range over 8 years of action, Israeli strikes in Syria, compares quite dramatically to then the findings over the course of these 11 days. And I think it's important to note, so this was our case study, but we also looked at civilian harm allegations in Israel. And I'll talk a little bit about those a bit later, but those were the numbers that we found, and you can see them on the bottom of the screen. But this was our kind of starting point for our analysis. And now I'll talk about the explanations that we found, and then I would kind of defer it to the colleagues to kind of go into that in detail. So one of the key findings was we looked at where are civilians alleged to have been killed, and what is happening in those civilian harm allegations. And this was one of our more striking findings, was that in each of the allegations of civilian harm in Gaza, in about 20% of those cases, there were also reports of militants having been killed. But it's important to remember here that we're only talking about civilian harm allegations. So we're primarily monitoring civilian harm. So we're not talking about cases where only militants were killed. We're talking about cases where those, 151 cases where civilians themselves were killed. And we can see that, as I said, in 80% of those incidents, civilians were the only known victim in those cases. By contrast, it's almost the opposite in Syria. So in Syria, we're seeing a proportionally lower number of civilian harm allegations, but in the vast majority of those cases, militants are also being killed. And I think it's important to have a kind of pinch of salt approach to this, because obviously in the Gaza Strip, media is quite controlled. Data on civilians and militant identity is often contested. But I think as a broad brush kind of understanding, we can see that Israel made choices, and they have made choices in Syria about targeting militants within certain types of locations, and they didn't make the same choices in the Gaza Strip, is the kind of suggestion from this finding. So, for example, we're looking at in Syria, we're seeing militants primarily killed in munitions factories, or as a result of a kind of certain convoys being targeted, kind of purely military structures. And then we did a bit of analysis on the flip side in the Gaza Strip, and we found that, I think it was in 17 cases, militants were being killed in their homes. So we have 33 associated deaths where these would be neighbors, they would be family members of militants killed in their homes. We looked also at the tunnel system. So Hamas militants are accused of having this kind of metro system where there are tunnels underneath quite populated areas. And when those tunnels were targeted, when Israel made the choice to target those tunnels, we saw these kind of severe civilian casualty events. So we saw one of the cases with the most civilian harm on the 16th of May, where it was about 49 people, I think, were killed in when a strike hit a tunnel and the whole building kind of collapsed. And it was, 3 different families were killed in that incident. You can see a picture of that on the screen here. So one of the first findings, just to sum up briefly, was we were seeing in Syria, one of the explanations for that kind of proportionally lower number would be the choices that Israel made about who they were targeting and where. And then the second point, and I think this is one that I'd really like to get into with the other panelists as well, because as Laura said, this is a case study. We're taking Israel and Palestine out of the kind of understanding of political, legal framework of the conflict at this point, and we're purely looking at civilian harm. And what we found here is not super radical. It's not a kind of crazy idea, but we found it highly consistent with all of the other information that we have found and all of the other conflicts that we've monitored, in that the higher the population density, the more civilians would be killed. So if you look at this map, we've just done a zoom in on the right-hand side, but the whole Gaza Strip on the left-hand side, and that's where my point about the geolocation team and their brilliance comes into effect, is that when you map civilian harm, so the bigger these broad circles, the more civilians, some more civilian fatalities. So the kind of larger circles you see clustered there are these cases where a bunch of civilians have died, proportionally larger than the places where you have smaller black circles. The kind of darker orange, the darker reddish color are cases where you have a higher population density. So we looked at the most recent population density figures we could find, and then we created this heat map. And then we looked at the damage sites reported by OCHA, so the kind of from the humanitarian community. We used these as a proxy to understand the strikes themselves. So you can't really see it in this map here, but you can kind of see all those little blue dots indicate where there have been strikes during the course of that conflict. And you can see, for example, if you look into this in the report, when you go kind of south towards the lower part of the Gaza Strip, you can see a bunch of those little dots, but you also see that they're happening in areas where there aren't that many civilians. So there aren't that many civilians that have been killed. And I think, as I was saying, this may seem a point of kind of obvious finding, but I think the important reason that we're all here today is that this is actually the status quo. And we as civil society are trying to find a way that we can break through that status quo, and that we can say, okay, this isn't something that we think is normal. It shouldn't be normal, even though it's a kind of like a logical conclusion. If you use these weapons in populated areas, more civilians will die. Our data suggests that. And we took this approach, and Georgia, if you pop to the next slide, we took this approach. We did the same thing for our data in Syria, and the same thing for the data we had for Israel. And I mean, there are lots of caveats behind certain population density data in Syria, just because it's, obviously after several years of conflict, population on the move, it's quite difficult to kind of have a scientific analysis of these things. But again, taking the most recent population information, we could find that all of those strikes where civilians have been killed, again, using that kind of circular approach, the greater number of civilians are the ones that were killed when strikes were conducted in populated areas. And that zoom in of the map that you can see there, that's the area around Damascus, these kind of darker colors to indicate higher numbers of civilians. And those are the areas where we found the most civilians would have been killed as a result of Israeli action. And again, using these kind of slightly other different proxies to understand where the strikes are happening kind of in general. And we're seeing that when of those few cases in Syria, using the same approach to understanding civilian harm in the Gaza Strip, the same kind of holds true, that the higher the population density, the more civilians were killed. And again, in Israel, again, we have comparatively, it's a low number of cases, but at the same time, where those civilians were killed, it's 10 civilians in total. We've done a kind of proxy for understanding population density because the data is a little bit difficult to compare, but kind of looking at satellite imagery of urban areas and residential areas. And those civilians that were predominantly killed were killed in these residential areas. So I think, these were the key findings of our report. We've done a lot of different analysis, different ways of kind of looking at the information, and it does feel inhuman to kind of package up data in a certain way, because these are civilian lives and they are, people who've been affected in a way that's kind of unimaginable. But I think all of that evidence base and that archive kind of holds true with a lot of other cases we've seen in other areas. And I think what we're trying to get in this report, if you go to the next slide, is to kind of help us understand these questions within the broader context of urban warfare. And part of the other bit of analysis that we were doing was looking at, for example, statements made by the IDF and by Al-Qassam and the militant fighters on the Palestinian side about how they decided to kind of conduct themselves. And I think it was in in 17 cases, the IDF made statements where they said, you know, we're aware of the presence of civilians, we're aware of these kind of densely populated areas, and then in a couple of cases kind of decided not to act. And I think that's the key question for us in this, as we go through this panel, is how does that decision get made? You know, it's not a new thing, as I said. It's not particularly new information, especially to kind of an advanced military. But if advanced militaries know this, what are they doing to kind of limit that level of harm that we're seeing? And then the question is for kind of us as civil society, how can we make sure that that message gets across in a kind of effective way? So I'll kind of leave it there, hand it over to you, and I would encourage participants to have a look at the website and have a look at some of the products, and I'm very able to answer any questions, especially about the kind of how we got to some of the numbers that we did. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Emily, and to all of the Airwars team. I mean, that's really impressive research that you guys have been doing there, and such detailed work. And I think really important, like you say, to build up this very extensive evidence base. And, you know, there's some really stark findings in there, particularly I found in relation to Gaza, where we see such a high proportion of casualties being civilians. And like you say, it draws back to some fundamental decisions about choice of weapons and choice of context. And, you know, these are decisions that are consciously being made that we should challenge. We're going to turn to questions at the end of all of the presentations, but if you do have them as you are watching along, please put them in the Q&A box. Next, I would like to introduce Alma Tazlidsan Al-Osta, who is the Disarmament and Protection of Civilians Manager at Humanity and Inclusion, and a very active member of INU. And she's going to talk through to us in her presentation today about some of the longer term impacts of explosive weapon use. Alma, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Laura, and thanks to Airwars for inviting HI today. Humanity and Inclusion, also known as Handicap International, is an international humanitarian organization that responds to humanitarian needs generated by armed conflicts in many countries where we work today. I'm mentioning this because I would really like to be very transparent that this is not a product of our imagination. It is really documented and evidenced through our operations in many reports that we have issued so far. And something that Emily already said, it's really annoying and very disturbing that we always find the same results, and it always leads us to understanding that this is basically just a pattern of harm that creates humanitarian consequences. And I would like to kind of break apart these patterns of harms, first focusing on the long-term impact on human body. So those who get to survive these big blasts, impact on blasts on lungs, brain, and ears often result with a very long-term damage to the functionality of the whole and the overall body. On the other side, fragmentation and other objects that propel by the explosion can cause damage to internal organs depending on the entry point of the projectiles, but also can create fractures of the lower and or upper limbs. And most of the time, fragmentation injuries to limbs result with amputations, leaving the body impaired for life. It really takes months, sometimes even years, for people to accept the loss of their body part. And it takes years to learn to walk with a prosthesis or to use a wheelchair. And these are all injuries which we can see they're visible to an eye. What is not visible to an eye is the psychological impact of bombing and shelling. And I think you mentioned that, Laura, at the beginning, but just to complement it with a bit of data, in 2016, we conducted a survey among Syrian refugees in Jordan and found that 80% of people injured expressed signs of high psychological distress, as a result of which 66% were unable to carry out essential daily activities because of their feelings of fear, anger, fatigue, distress, and hopelessness. 75% of children under 5 assessed. I'm going to repeat this again because it's really compelling data. 75% of children under 5 felt so afraid that nothing could calm them down. But impacts of explosive weapons on civilians are not limited only to the harm on their life and their health. What we call reverberating or domino effects follow the destruction or damage of the critical infrastructure and just multiply the impacts and raises, in fact, more the needs of the population impacted by the use of these weapons. So even when civilian infrastructure is not directly targeted, but the attack is launched against a legitimate military objective, infrastructure and services are often either directly impacted from the wide area effects, or they suffer from these reverberating or domino effects of the attack. And I'm going to come to this right now. Civilians living in populated areas generally rely on centralized essential services like we all do, like electricity, water and sanitation, healthcare, education, and all other services that are part of our lives. These services contain three main components each: hardware, including infrastructure and equipment, people, especially operations and maintenance staffs, and consumables such as fuel or chlorine or medicine. These components are interdependent, meaning that no component is sufficient on its own. For example, there is no use of having consumables when there is no staff to ensure the functionality of a service. As a result, the impact of an attack on any component of a service will have the terminal impact on the service as a whole. And there is a whole report that PAX did on this reverberating impact of explosive weapons. In Yemen, HI did a few case studies looking into domino effects on the impact of explosive weapons on food security, damage to Yemen's roads and bridges, destruction and disruption to health services, and endangering Yemen's access to water. One of the examples is Hodeidah port. That's the largest port and the vital lifeline for food security there. And before the conflict in Yemen, they imported 90% of its necessary goods, including food, medicine, and fuel through this port. In August 2015, Hodeidah port was heavily damaged by airstrikes that destroyed the port's control towers, main cranes, and only several of warehouses. And the damage immediately reduced the port's capacity to receive critical imports, including the food, medicine, and the fuel. After the incident, it took 6 weeks for only one crane to be rebuilt. In the meantime, there was reported 28% rise in food prices across Yemen in the period between August and September 2015. Reduced port capacity meant that not only was Yemen receiving less food, but also smaller amounts of the fuel needed to power generators that enables Yemen's water systems, health facilities, and even the transport of goods. This is how the whole system slowly collapses, making the environment impossible to live in. Basic safety is continuing concern for communities living through the use of explosive weapons, but also in aftermath, because not all explosive weapons detonate on impact. A few weeks ago, we in HI have launched a report on contamination in Iraq, focusing on the leftover contamination stemming from the 2014-2017 conflict between the Islamic State and pro-government forces. Contamination is primarily found in urban and semi-rural areas from explosive improvised devices and a large amount of unexploded ordnance from air and artillery strikes, rockets, attacks, and heavy mortars. One of the most important findings is that contamination in urban settings is so complex in nature and often referred to as three-dimensional, meaning that it can be found everywhere, buried under the ground, concealed under the rubble, inside of civilians' homes. And this constant fear for lives and these unbearable long-term consequences are one of the main leading causes of forced displacement, driving hundreds of thousands of people to seek protection abroad. These are the reasons why we in HI, as well as I think wider international community, is in fact alarmed by the humanitarian consequences of urban warfare. We have been noticing that as the world is urbanizing, so does the armed conflict. When cities are bombed and shelled, whether by airstrikes, rockets, or artillery, civilians are bearing the brunt, as we have just heard in the presentation. Parties to the conflict should recognize that they cannot fight in populated areas in the way that they would fight in open battlefields. They must recognize that using heavy explosive weapons in cities and towns place civilians at high risk of indiscriminate harm. Deaths, injuries, psychological trauma, destruction, no or very limited to healthcare services or education, rubble instead of homes, displacement, poverty, exclusion. These are all reality of people living in urban warfare, and they are creating a humanitarian crisis. This pattern of violence is treated as normal, unexceptional, or simply just a necessary part of conflict, but it's not. It is unacceptable. And we hope that the future political declaration will end this direct and indirect human suffering caused by the use of explosive weapons. I will hand it over to you now, Laura, and happy to answer all the questions.
Thanks very much, Alma, for that presentation. As always, when I hear you talk about this, you know, these situations that we look at, you paint a very clear picture of really what it means for people that are living under bombing and that are attempting to rebuild their lives afterwards. And it's so important to hear that. Like you say, it's not normal, it's unacceptable, and we really need to challenge this. I'm now going to turn to our final speaker, Sabah Azim, who is the project lead for the Human Security Survey at PAX, where she looks at Iraq in particular. Sabah, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Laura, and to Airwars for touching upon this very important subject today. Me personally, I'm going to discuss what happened in Hawija in 2015. So this is the night of the 2nd and 3rd of June, where an airstrike on apparently an ISIS munitions factory killed or claimed lives of 70 civilians, a very conservative estimate. Also, to give something a bit more on the tangible aspects of people like to know and call. So this was the industrial district, heart of the Hawija center, but this is based on old patterns. So that means houses and housing and civilian infrastructure were very intertwined. So they're not separate, industrial areas like we see here in the Western world. So apart from 70 civilians, which died on paper, this also led to 1,200 businesses being absolutely flattened to the ground, which included 20 car showrooms, 5 ice factories, 3 brick factories, 1 flour mill, an electricity substation, a fuel station, the municipality department, the civil defense department, as well as 9 of their vehicles, which looked after the entire district and not just the city, the education department, in terms of land where agriculture was happening. So about 140 out of 520 dunams of land was directly impacted, and a dunam is a traditional unit of measure, about 2,500 square meters per dunam. And what has come out later is that, and this was discussed a couple of weeks ago when the mayor was here visiting the Netherlands, as well as in an article yesterday by a journalist that claims that this factory or this storage, which was housing all this, or which was storing basically all this explosive materials, was not the actual target, but the target were 2 trucks that have containers on them. They were the main targets, and they contained C4, which is a highly explosive material, as we all know. So the target really was mobile. So when Laura also talked about choice, ICRC talks about choice of weapon, but here we also talk about the choice of when do you hit the actual target. So the mayor asked, and rightfully so, why weren't these trucks targeted before they entered a populated area, before they created such wide area effects? So the choice also then needs to be, unpacked, and it's not only, again, choice of weapons, but a lot more. What is also interesting is that and these pictures that are being shown in the background are pictures from now, so 6.5 years later. What is extremely disappointing is the fact that this only came to public light in October 2019, 4.5 years after this incident took place. So why this silence, why this lack of accountability is also a very big question here, especially when we're talking about political declarations and states being held to account for what they've done. I would also like to bring the human element here, because for the past year, we've been interviewing a lot of civilians on the ground. So we've interviewed 119 civilians through our local partner, Al-Ghad, who were directly impacted by this airstrike. And I would really like to bring to light the story of Omar, who's a young boy. He was playing hide and seek with his two siblings at the time, and this is around midnight. And they were playing near their family car. And when the explosion happened, it also burnt their car and the fuel in it to such an extent that all three siblings were burnt, but Omar the most. Especially his face, because this was under ISIS control. There was no, the electricity station was impacted, not the water station itself, but the water network was impacted. The hospital was under ISIS control at the time. So Omar could not get medical attention. By the time Omar got medical attention for his burns, it was already years later by the time the family managed to get out to Kirkuk and then to Erbil. And that meant that his scars, his burns were very old and he needed plastic surgery. And the estimate for that is $30,000. And of course, also that he has to go abroad and it can't be done in Iraq. The boy, when Hawija was liberated in 2017 and when he managed to go back to school, he was bullied. So his mother transferred him to another school and he was bullied again. So now he just refuses to go to school because he's bullied so much. So how that trauma that he's been living with for 6.5 years, the fact that he's out of school is creating that cycle over and over again. And no matter how much you compensate, how can you compensate for it is the question really. And then to his grandfather, Atiyah, he also had a fairly successful business in the industrial area. I think the family used to own car shops, especially to do with car oil and mechanics and so on. And he saw so much death and destruction that night. He himself was burnt on his body. That since then he has tried to commit suicide twice. Once by shooting himself and once by jumping off the roof, and his family has managed to save him both times, and now they don't let him go anywhere alone because they're afraid of what he might do again. And that just goes to show that even, it's not only the material damage, it's also the psychological harm that continues and that haunts you forever. So how do you compensate these people? And again, so these are just, at the human level, at the what we're talking about reverberating effects as well. Hawija was also the center where a lot of agricultural research took place. And they used to create saplings to distribute to the rest of the country for them to produce and grow. So it used to produce about 1.2 million saplings a year and distribute it to the rest of the country. Now the capacity has been reduced to only 200,000 saplings a year. So that is to say that one incident has a ripple effect on that community, yes, but it also has a ripple effect on the rest of the country. So again, how do you quantify it? What is extremely disappointing as well is the lack of amends and the lack of apology. The Dutch only recognized it or acknowledged it when it came out, thanks to investigative journalists. And I would really like to come back to the political declaration. Of course, we're talking about the avoidance policy, but now that this incident has been carried out, the first thing is that the states ensure that forces take into account direct and reverberating effects on civilian harm and civilian objects. The question really is, was it done? Especially when the target was mobile. Was these reverberating effects actually taken into account when they did the CDE? The second thing is on collecting and sharing this aggregated data. Again, this only came to public light thanks to investigative journalists, and a part of the reason why Park's Utrecht University and Al-Gha decided to embark on this research is because we were frustrated by the lack of research coming out that the Dutch government refused to even investigate or to even go to Hawija in the first place. And the third is make efforts to assist victims and survivors and their families. Thus far, not a single Dutch government representative has been to Hawija. They've only been to Skype calls with the mayor, and they have announced 4 million euros, and they have given them to two agencies which are not trusted by the people of Hawija, by the civilians. So the question really is that when you are making efforts to assist victims, are you really considering their voice in it? So that in summary is is what I'd like to talk about today. And of course, as Laura already mentioned and Alma did, that for wide area effects, you can read a publication that Parks did with Article 36 as well. And the reverberating effects as well was a book that we released early on this year. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Saba. That was another very illustrative, I think, and devastating case study there, both on a community level, but also on an individual level. And I think Pax has documented this alongside Airwars in another report, Seeing Through the Rubble. So I definitely encourage everyone to look that up. But thanks also for ending with some of those questions that we want to see states addressing through the political declaration and how they foresee this harm and factor this in and ultimately prevent it. I'd like to thank all of our presenters today. Before we take questions, we have the pleasure of being joined by Dr. Samuel Kogalati from the Green Party in Belgium. He also serves as a vice chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Dr. Kogalati, it is a pleasure to have you here. I know you've been very active on this issue and through your work on the parliamentary resolution in Belgium. And I'd like you to invite you to share some reflections on the presentations that we've just heard, and perhaps if you could just tell us a bit more about the work that you've been doing in Belgium. Over to you.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you so much for your presentations. I must tell you very honestly that I'm extremely impressed by all your work and the mobilization of civil society. It's extremely impressive, and really, I mean, your work is terrific. And that is important because this moment is really key. We're approaching finally the end of the negotiations for a strong political declaration on EWIPA. The last round of negotiations is scheduled in February of next year. And so I really believe that this is now the key moment to urge states, and especially democratic states, to promote an ambitious political declaration. And I think that next to civil society and next to all your efforts, we as democratically elected parliamentarians, we also have a role to play. We can also contribute to the fight, and we can also try to put the bar very high in order for the political declaration to meet a certain number of requirements. And so as you mentioned, I just wanted to share with you the good and positive experience of the adoption of the very first parliamentary resolution requesting a government, in this case Belgium, my country, to adopt a declaration to protect civilians against the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. I must tell you that it took time. It was a long process of discussions, internal negotiations with parties from the left, from the right, from the center. We also had hearings, not only with the ICRC and Handicap International. Handicap International was really key, I have to emphasize that, in the adoption and even the redaction of all the nuances of this resolution. But we also had to hear and invite the Belgian defense. And I can tell you in all honesty that the first hearing was quite difficult, and the defense even came back to us on various amendments on our resolution, and the first feedback of the Belgian defense was quite dramatic. They interpreted our resolution as, they said, a blanket ban of any kind of weapon. They said that basically we were forbidding war. And so it went quite far. But it was also an interesting process of discussions, of meetings, and I believe a very fruitful effort to engage with the people of the Belgian defense, of the defense ministry, also of foreign affairs. And so that's why I think that the parliament can also act as an interesting forum to build consensus among those various actors and really to bridge the gap between, civil society, parliamentarians from various parties, but also officials from defense and foreign affairs ministers. But so we refused in Belgium, and we adopted a very strong resolution and we refuse to accept that, you know, these deaths are inevitable. We know that a civilian is killed every 24 minutes by a bomb or explosive weapon targeting an urban area. We've seen the results of your important research again today. It sounds logical, of course, when you target a densely populated area, the risk that you kill civilians is, of course, significantly higher. But I think that politically, we cannot accept it as a statu quo. And we have a responsibility, again, as parliamentarians, to act and to push our governments in the right direction, especially now, 1 month in advance before the last round of negotiations. Maybe coming back to our resolution, there are 3 points of tensions, 3 very difficult points of negotiations with other parties. We finally, in the end, reached a large majority, a large democratic majority, but the nationalist right-wing party from Flanders and also the far right opposed and rejected our resolution in the end. But the 3 points that were the most contentious were, one, the idea, well, the fake idea that we would be, you know, forbidding and banning all kinds of explosive weapons. So that was really a difficult process to emphasize that, no, we want to avoid explosive weapons. And this avoidance principle was really difficult to push. And I must tell you that it's really took like hours of discussions with our political partners. But again, it was interesting to show that, look, this is again a political declaration. It's a non-binding document, but that should also have a real impact on the ground. And it was also an opportunity for us to show that, look, because of the physical context, because those areas are so densely populated, well, the use of those weapons makes them extremely dangerous for civilian populations. Another aspect that was very difficult and quite controversial in the process of the adoption of this resolution was the domino effects. The defense ministry wanted us to, you know, to keep the well-known principles of direct and indirect effects, but they didn't want us to go further and beyond that, and they didn't want us to adopt this reference to domino or reverberating effects. But that was really key for us. That was extremely important to us to keep it in the resolution, and we, in the end, succeeded in showing that indeed the effects of explosive weapons on civilians are not limited to the instant of detonation itself of the weapon. We also want to show that beyond the immediate and direct effects, even beyond the indirect effects, there are reverberating effects or domino effects on civilian populations. And finally, and that was also a third and an important aspect of our call to the government, was to allow unconditional access to humanitarian aid, so the humanitarian assistance to civilians. So again, I'm very proud of what we were able to achieve in Belgium, thanks to the huge efforts of, again, Handicap International. Alma was absolutely amazing in helping us achieve this political result. But I think it's now also an interesting document, not only for, you know, communication purposes. So it's true that we tried also to bring awareness in the public. We tried to celebrate this vote by inaugurating a new monument in Brussels. It was last May, a few months ago, to the unknown civilian. So not only the unknown soldier, but also paying respect and paying tribute to the unknown civilians killed. But I think it's also now an important document to recall the responsibilities of our governments right now, a few weeks ahead of this last round of negotiations in Geneva. So again, the message I want to send, and this is how I would like to conclude, is that we can play a role as parliamentarians, and we can definitely help you. And this is really an engagement, that, you know, a commitment that I want to renew here in the end as a way to conclude. I really think that we can help you protecting civilians from explosive weapons in populated areas. But thank you again for your kind invitation.
Thank you so much, Samuel. We're so grateful for your words there, but also for your very active work on this theme. And, you know, thanks to HI that have done so much outreach and work with parliamentarians too. We're very confident that the work you've been doing in Belgium can put Belgium in a much better position in the negotiations. It's a key country, it's a NATO state, one that's involved in military operations. And so perhaps it's not too surprising that we get this pushback from militaries that is familiar to all of us, I think, that have been speaking to states that have militaries. You know, they do have some anxieties about this, but I don't think they're insurmountable. I think it's a very practical and reasonable response that we're seeking from states on this. So thank you so much. And now I'd like to turn to Mr. Alan Smith. He's a member of the Scottish National Party, an MP for Stirling, as well as Foreign Affairs spokesperson. Mr. Smith, you've been very actively involved in several weapons and human rights issues, including on the export of arms, raising rightly concerns over transfers of weapons to places where we've seen them used, harming civilians as a result of bombing and shelling in populated areas. I wondered if you could please share some perspectives on what you would like to see the UK government do at the upcoming negotiations, and also just broadly what the position of the SNP is on this issue. Thank you, and over to you.
Well, thanks, Laura, and thank you for the invitation to Airwars, and thank you also for your work. It's important that we do gather and have meetings like this, even if it is only virtually, to share the experience across the borders as well, internationally, because this is a coalition that we need to put some energy behind. And I'd very much echo Samuel's commitment to you that there are parliamentarians who can help with this stuff, and we're keen to do so. As the SNP at Westminster, we're the third biggest bloc. Obviously, we have a different constitutional view to the UK, but I can certainly warmly praise Belgium as not being as advanced as the UK is. My job's to help show what an independent Scotland would be like, but meantime, also demonstrate that there are progressive voices within this and reach out to other parties to bring forward these progressive ideas. So I'm really pleased that my team, Roddy and Paul, have done a power of work on this with Airwars. And the SNP will be launching a protection of civilians paper early in the new year, which has been very much worked on with our friends in the NGOs. And as the third biggest bloc within the Westminster Parliament, I really will be reaching out to the other parties to encourage them to do the same, because the UK does need to adopt an atrocity prevention strategy, and it needs to do it urgently, and other countries need to do the same. And I'm struck, very much struck in terms of reading this paper, that the role of NGOs and journalists in making sure that there is accountability in war is absolutely vital, because the laws that are passed are easy. It's easy to pass laws, but unless we're actually enforcing them, and we can't do that without evidence and without the actual proof of what's happened, the testimony of the people who were affected, in order to get justice for them, but also to hold the bad actors to account as well. So the prevention, the atrocity prevention strategy is something that I think the UK could adopt and should adopt. We should take a leaf out of Belgium's book and the works that Samuel's been doing. But there are other countries looking at this as well. And that's where I think meetings like this are so important, to share that experience and share that knowledge. And certainly for my part, we'll be launching the paper, as I say, in the early new year. But what I want to do is to build a coalition of UK parliamentarians and others to actually progress this agenda and to put this forward. But I think that's enough speechifying from me. I'm really here to support you guys and thank you for your work, very, very sincerely, because there's a lot of work needs to be done yet to actually progress this forward. But certainly from our part, I would like to see that the UK be much more active than it has been in the run-up to the Geneva talks. And I think this is something that the UK could and should get itself behind, and certainly I'll be promoting that within London with colleagues here. But keen to hear questions and comments, so look forward to the question session.
Thanks so much, Alan. It's great to have SNP's support for this, and we look forward to seeing the Protection of Civilians paper early next year. And I think it's just so encouraging and motivating to hear from both you and Samuel, and your commitment as parliamentarians to work closely with us in civil society on this issue. It's really a crucial time, like you say. We are at the hour now. We're going to continue going for another 10 minutes or so with questions. So I hope that most of you can stay on for that. And I hope panelists can all stay on and answer questions here. I'm going to do just a question for each of you, but obviously feel free to share any other closing remarks as well, because I'm not sure we're going to get to much more questions after this. But Emily, we had a question for you around targeting in relation to Gaza in particular. And I think the gist of the question really is whether the civilian harm that we're seeing, is this a result of poor targeting where Israeli forces aren't identifying a specific military objective and just using explosive force in these areas? Or is it the result of use of explosive weapons that are in this context causing harm because of the densely populated areas? So I'll let you answer that, but I'm going to run through the other couple of questions first. Alma, one of the things that you talked about was the long-term effects of explosive weapon use, and you listed quite a few there: the psychological trauma, including the impact on children, displacement, contamination, food security. The list is long there. But this issue of reverberating effects has received a lot of attention, both in terms of concern over the impact, but also in how it's being addressed in the political declaration negotiations. So I wondered if you could share some reflections on what you would like to see happen through addressing this in Geneva in February. And then Saba, I think you raised a really important point around accountability and militaries being transparent about civilian harm incidents and data on this, which is, I think, a strong theme as well that we see through Airwars' work, as well as that of PAX. And I just wondered if you could share a few remarks on why you think this is so important. And also, you spoke a bit to this, but how this can be brought out more in the political declaration. So Emily, if I can hand over to you first.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. And maybe just as a kind of final note also from Airwars, to thank the panelists and the MPs for this very interesting discussion. And I think it's, this is just the beginning of many conversations I hope that we have, especially as we lead into the run-up of those political talks. Just to answer that question, it's a very good one, and it's not one that we're necessarily well placed to answer, honestly. I think the choices that militaries make and the intelligence that they have is something that we don't have access to understanding. So I wouldn't want to kind of pass comment on, is it that Israel are bad at targeting? I think the question for me is more, what choices do they make knowing that these are the effects that that's going to happen? And I think it would kind of lean more to the latter, as you were saying, Laura, that we know that when certain types of weapons are used in urban environments, they're going to cause this kind of harm. And I think that's the kind of overarching message that we want to kind of make sure that we get across in this talk, that the discussion around precision warfare, the discussion around intelligence gathering, the most advanced militaries in the world, it doesn't matter. When you use these weapons in urban environments, you're going to kill people. And I think that's what we're seeing in the Gaza, in Aleppo, in Raqqa, in Mosul, in Hawija, and that's the kind of common denominator underlying all of this. Thank you. I hope that answered the question.
Absolutely, great answer. Thank you, Emily. Alma.
Yes, thank you very much, Laura. In fact, yes, while we were discussing the reverberating effects with states, as Samuel also said, there is something that is not really understandable. First of all, this word is just so not usually what we use in everyday language, and it's not part of the IHL. So I think this is something that really confuses a lot of states when we mention it in a humanitarian perspective. So what I would like to happen in Geneva is that we really adopt a strong political declaration, not adopt, but finalize this draft of a strong political declaration. And I think, first of all, we have to define what is the wide area effect, because these reverberating effects are are a result of these wide area effects of explosive weapons that are used in populated areas. So that is the first step that we have to work on with states, and while we are drafting this political declaration, and then say and clearly define what is the humanitarian impact that is resulting from the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects, and what are these reverberating effects that we are talking about. So things have to be clear in the political declaration. We don't want to have one document that is just going to be a lot of words put on a paper that will end up in a drawer and not produce any kind of consequence on the protection of civilians from the use of explosive weapons. We want a political declaration that will change and also challenge militaries to adapt their policies on these environments that we are seeing, in these complex environments where explosive weapons are used. So this is really, at the end of the day, we don't want explosive weapons to be used in areas where civilians are living, where children are going to school, where markets are full, where services are functioning, and where everybody's relying on them. It doesn't make sense because the impact is too big, and it's just unnecessary to have these kind of impacts that we see on a daily basis from the conflict area. So yes, a strong political declaration that will address all what I have mentioned and much more. Of course, I think that's something that we have to strive towards, and that if we don't get it, we will not win this initiative that we have started.
Thank you, Alma, for laying that out so clearly there. Saba, over to you.
I think what Alma said, when they attacked Hodeidah, the food insecurity and the severe malnutrition in Yemen was man-made. It was not natural. So when these weapons are deployed, they do have consequences. And when we're talking about collecting and sharing disaggregated data, and then also when we're talking about accounting for reverberating effects in the CDE, if you don't collect and share data, how can you account for reverberating effects in the CDE? And then the accountability part as well. Saying that data collection is not possible because it's a dangerous environment. I'm sorry, that's a very poor excuse. And what I've also found is that policymakers are very distant from the actual civilians on the ground. There's a lot of research being done, which is capturing these civilian experiences. So why aren't they being taken seriously? Why do we have such a colonial mindset when it comes to civilian experiences? And then to go a step further, yes, the political declaration needs to be adopted, but then also there need to be concrete steps on how this needs to be put into practice, because it's only then we'll see the effects of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saba, and thanks to all of our presenters. I think that brings us to the end of the session today. I would like to thank everyone for staying on because we have run a little bit over. Just before we close, I thought I'd just briefly mention, because it's come up a few times, about the political declaration negotiations. We are expecting, or it has been scheduled, that the next round of negotiations will take place in Geneva from the 2nd to the 4th of February next year. And this will be in person, all being well. A new draft text of the political declaration is also going to be shared by Ireland ahead of that, so hopefully by the end of the year. So we'd encourage everyone and anyone who would like to take part in these discussions to take part. It's going to be the final round of negotiations, and as we heard from Samuel, Alma and others, we want an ambitious outcome here. It needs to make a difference in terms of the impact that it has on the ground. We need to set the bar high and hold states to account so that we can change policy and practice and better protect civilians. So I think that's it from all of us. I would just like to thank all of our presenters for their presentations, congratulate Airwars on getting this excellent research report out, and also, of course, to thank Samuel and Alan for their contributions, both here, but also on an ongoing basis through their work with us. So thank you so much, everyone, and take care.